I want to tell you a story because, you know, I'm conscious as a teacher, I'm conscious when I was a director of religious studies and I'm looking after sort of RE4 the country, as I was saying, that you can get a bit arrogant, you can get a bit full of yourself, or I can get a bit full of myself. When Callum was 4, we went to St Mary's Parish, my hometown. This is my home church here. In fact, Callum's cleaning the cross there, crucifix. The reality here is that this church is at risk. There's been a lot of earthquakes in the area. It's not up to earthquake regulations, and in every likelihood, this church is going to be closed. In actual fact, Callum's grandmother was staying with my mum. Had just been talking the night before about the fact that the church is probably going to be pulled down. And then, almost in the next breath, she says, but it's also spring cleaning, so will you guys help us when we go along to clean the church tomorrow? I said, sure. Callum goes, what? Like they're going to pull it down and we're still going to go and clean it? And his grandmother says, yes, that's right, yeah. He looks at me and I go, we're doing it because your grandmother says we've got to do it. That's the story of my life. So off we go the next day, this church. By the way, that's my mum just there. Right, take yourself back. Callum was 4 years old. We rocked on up to Holy Thursday. And the person who was responsible for the liturgy from the parish council stood up and said, we're going to do something different. What we're going to do is we're going to invite you to wash each other's feet. We've put bowls all around the outside. We haven't picked anybody. There's no one who's going to step up and do this. We've just put the bowls and the towels. We're going to have some quiet music and you can just stand up and wash each other's feet. And I was thinking to myself, this is going to crash and burn. This is going to be a disaster. They haven't picked anybody to start it off. There's no one who's actually sort of suggesting that others should go up. They haven't even got a wee team of themselves to actually get the ball rolling and that. I'm sitting there, nothing's happened for maybe 30 seconds, might have been a minute, right? And I'm rolling through my DRS thinking at school, right? So the DRS, I look after liturgy at the school for years. I've been involved in liturgy at parish. I know how liturgy works. And as I'm thinking all of these things that they should have done differently and how it should have been fixed and how this was not going to be a particularly spiritual event, whether it's Holy Thursday or not, I get a nudge in my ribs from a 4-year-old. And Callum says, I'll do you, Dad. I turned my head, my whole world on its head. I go, okay, and what am I thinking? I'm thinking, flippin' heck, no one's got up yet. We're going to be the first ones to actually get up. I'm thinking, how does this happen? As I'm rolling through all these negative sort of thoughts, suddenly my boy goes, I'll do you. So up we get, thank goodness he led us down the back, so didn't have to go and sit up the front. There was a chair at the front. We get down the back and he takes his shoes and socks off, sits up on the chair and pokes his foot out at me. And I get the cloth and the water jug, I pour it over his feet. I mean, Jan had had a stroke when Callum was only 10 days old. She'd never done any of his cares because she couldn't really. I'd washed this boy's feet his whole life. This was just deeply, deeply spiritual. And then as I'm drying his feet, he goes, now I'll do you. And so I sit up there and he starts to undo my laces. And then he sort of lifts up my foot and he pours water over it. My 4-year-old son dries my feet. It's a moment that has changed my life in lots of ways. Not in the great grand ones, but it was a marker for me that in the work that I do, I must always be ready for when God gets in, for when God speaks to the situation. That liturgy is not always about getting things in the right order or with the right sort of sentiment, but allowing a space where God can actually come in and touch our lives, as Callum did to me then. So, if we are teachers in schools, and if what we do is meaningful in terms of our religious education, then we're continually reaching out to people that might not understand what it is that we're doing, who don't have a full grasp of what's happening. Now, in our schools, many parents come to a Catholic school with a whole bunch of attitudes that are just deeply flawed. Not because they're negative people, they're often wonderful people, but their idea of what Catholic education is quite flawed. And a lot of them come to the school and say, well, I'll go to that school even though it's Catholic, or despite it's Catholic. Whereas what we're wanting them to do is come to schools because they're Catholic, because there's this opportunity to interact with Catholic culture and with the Spirit of God working in our places. So, you know, this notion that our kids are going to be brainwashed, this awful image here of people, you probably can't see it, but they're coming up with keys on their back. So there's sort of wind up. That what church does is that it disengages us from reality and focuses us on basically a load of nonsense. It switches off our brain and sends us out into the world like we're some sort of robotic piece of machinery. But the reality, of course, as we know, it's not like that in our schools. And all of these things like memorising and only being focused on children and disconnected and being elitist, you know, the notion of paying massive great fees to go to Catholic schools. How do you retain a sense of education for everybody with that, without digging really deeply into what it is that our school stands for? None of these are true. And in actual fact, what they are these in our schools. Our pastoral care is linked to an understanding, not just of Catholic knowledge, but of an awareness that it's Christ that's at the centre. So, when we focus on community, it's because we have an awareness in the Gospels that Jesus focused on community. How many times did he talk to multitudes? How many times did he talk about family? Our pastoral care of reaching out, we see in Jesus when he reaches out to the lepers, when he reaches out to those people that are possessed by spirits where they can't connect to community. His healing isn't just about fixing the body. His healing is always about fixing the heart, fixing the soul. The values that our schools are grounded on are the values that Jesus preaches in the Beatitudes. They're the values that he preaches when he talks about separating the sheep from the goats. That when we challenge and engage our young people, it's because we understand that the person of Jesus was constantly challenging and engaging. Think of those two brothers along the road. I mean, they're already in the mix. And they're talking about who's going to be top when they get to heaven. Flipping Jesus hears them, doesn't he? And he teaches them, challenges them that they've got it all wrong. And how many times poor old Peter tried to understand parables and coming up to Jesus and saying, so what was that one about? What was that you were talking about? I think that in our Catholic schools, we need to be, as teachers, almost always balanced on like one foot, so that we're trying to keep our balance, but we've got to work to keep it. If we're solid and absolutely grounded, we've lost something. Or at least we're at risk. Because the very nature of Christ's message is to nudge us always to be better, to challenge in a joyful way, I think, for us to become better people. We're fully Catholic not because we're exclusive. We're fully Catholic because our understanding of Jesus and relationship with Trinity is something that is empowering. Jesus, his message was for everyone. The learning and thinking that goes on in RE, centred on Christ, obviously, but also, again, challenging. Not something that just sits, but something that people have to engage in. In the Gospels, again, we see Jesus constantly reaching out, encouraging others to feed one another, encouraging others to reach out in justice, and encouraging each other to actually look for situations where justice is not present. I often find that conversation with the woman at the well to be a conversation around justice. You know, these issues of exclusion, issues of arrogance, issues of right relationship, so many things we've studied and read. But ultimately at its core, what is Jesus calling her to do, calling the apostles to do when they come back, calling us to do now, is to be people of justice. And this notion of inclusion. You know, why does he pick Samaritans in several of his stories to be the good guys? Because he's breaking down some of those barriers. So these are the schools that we already exist in. We know that we have to overcome those expectations of parents often and change them into situations where our parents can feel that they belong. I once went to a First Communion at our parish, and Jan and I were walking in from the side of the room. And as we came in, we noticed a woman was sort of crouched before the door. So we had sort of biggish wooden doors. So they weren't ideal, but you had to push them open to get through. And she was standing with one hand on the door. She looked petrified. And she says, "Am I allowed in? Am I allowed in? For goodness sake, if our school's parish for a First Communion, a mum that's arriving a little bit early, his dad's going to drop off the daughter later on who's going to receive First Communion. If she doesn't even know that she's allowed in, we've got some work to do." We're working on a document that's called the Religious Education Bridging Document. We're trying to get teachers to completely focus anew on what's happening with religious education in their place. And one of the phrases is this from that document. In Catholic school, teaching is much more a vocation than a profession. I think this isn't said enough. I think the teaching profession is often looking at establishing itself, certainly teachers in Catholic schools teaching RE, they want to be seen often the same as everything else. But in actual fact, RE is more than every other subject. So, claiming this as a vocation, it's linked to our Gospels, linked to the person of Jesus. We're being called when we choose to be an RE teacher. And even when it's thrust on us because the timetable requires that they need an RE teacher, not necessarily confident perhaps or somebody, but it's responding to a vocation. It's an opportunity to participate in the mission of Jesus by sharing his good news. And not just sharing it randomly, but with the children and the people that are in our care, and we also have a responsibility towards their families as well. Opportunity is such a much better word, I think, than challenge. But it's hard work. In this document that we're circulating that's gone right through the whole of New Zealand, we're actually saying to teachers, we know it's hard work. We do. And yet, this is another bit, even though it's challenging, this is what we're called into. Because in the face of a changing world, so much changing, technology changing, yes, relationships changing all the time, finances changing, values changing, constantly, should money be driving everything? How much does money drive things? In New Zealand we've had a lot of, there's a big push towards euthanasia being legalised in our country. And the conversations that have happened around family tables have been diverse. And a lot of people are just falling into the media sway because they don't really know where else to go. And yet, the Nathaniel Centre in New Zealand, which is the Bishop's Ethics Centre, has put out some fantastic stuff to say, look, there's a different way to think of this. It's just as locking somebody up. It's just as investing in helping families that are poor and families that are experiencing violence to be able to escape that cycle. This notion of increased individualism. Me. How do our young people fight that? Their education is not just for them. Their education is for the broad community. As soon as you start sharing Laudato Si with young people and breaking that open, they can't help but see that there's more to it than this. Massively decreased awareness of God's presence. It's not culturally appropriate often in young people's lives. New Zealand's one of the largest secular, or one of the per capita, the strongest secular countries in the world. And it's gaining traction every day. The notion of being a person of faith is quite distinct. How wonderful to be involved in an opportunity in Catholic schools to be able to challenge that, to introduce them to something that's richer and warmer and broader. So in the draft document we say the teacher of RE chooses to be the instrument of a different message. We have this opportunity to say something quite differently. We're responding to the very call of Jesus. And it's good news. If we say it often enough, we'll believe it. Yeah? the really tricky part for teachers is holding on to that enthusiasm, creativity and energy in the midst of so many other demands in their work. More and more and more and more is being dumped on teachers. But we have to know what it is that we're about so that we can focus on the things that are energising rather than the things that are negative. I nicked this off David Wells. I think the concept is this guy's going to fail. It's never going to achieve anything. But the sheer level of determination on his face, I think, is just about enough to win the day. You feel like Dad's going to turn up in the corner and biff him in the ear so that at least he gets a little bit of airtime. I'm going to tell you one more story. True story about how this can work in a school. I had this brainstorm with reconciliation. So we do right to reconciliation at Cadna College. And me and the chaplain, we had a yarn together. We decided that we could actually prepare the class in 10 minutes and actually get them down to reconciliation so that in 50 minutes, a class of 30 kids could easily go through the whole right to reconciliation. Sometimes 2 classes. And it went like this. I would arrive in the class, Father Gerard would be down already in the cathedral. I'd turn up in the class and I'd do my usual teacher thing. I'd say, right, everybody, could you be quiet, please? And of course, they never are completely quiet. There's always a few that are still talking. And so I would pick a student that I thought was sort of up for it. And I'd say, Sally, could you be quiet, please? And Sally would go, oh, sorry, Mr. MacLeod. And I go, no, I'm not sure that you are sorry. On a scale of 1 to 10, how sorry are you? And nearly every kid that I ever did this with would go, 3, maybe? And I go, yeah, that's what I thought. Because actual fact, sorry doesn't mean anything much anymore. It just trips off the tongue. In fact, for a lot of you, it's like the F word. F this, F that, I'm effed if I'm going to do that, I effing well can't be bothered, you're effing marvellous. You know, think about the word, it just is. Reconciliation is an opportunity when sorry means something. So we're going to go down to the church and we're going to experience the sacrament of reconciliation. And when you go up to Father and you say what it is that you're sorry for, God hears it and you're forgiven, then you know that that sorry means something. It's usually very profound. And so anyway, and then off we would go. So anyway, one day I'd come in and there was this, I won't use her real name, but let's say it was Sandra. And it's because it was a girl. And I did exactly the same thing. Right now, quiet everybody please. Sandra, could you be quiet? Oh, sorry, Mr. MacLeod. I'll go, no, I don't think you are sorry. And she went, I effing well am sorry. And boom, she was gone. Like, stormed out of the room, gone. And I'm standing there, the whole class is absolutely silent. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do now? And I said, look, this is how it's supposed to go. I was going to kill him, blah, 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 and sorry doesn't mean something, you know. And then one of her friends, Sandra's friends in the back row, she goes, bad day, Mr. MacLeod. And I go, yeah, I can tell that. I said, look, you guys need to go down to reconciliation. I've got to find her because this isn't good. And so off they go. And I'm thinking, God, are they going to go down to the cathedral in the first place? I mean, it's not far to go. They don't have to cross a road or anything, but you know, it's right down the other end of the street. And I hunt right around the school. I go up and down the stairs, and eventually I find her right up in the top area of the school, in a Kiva area, sitting in a seat by herself. She sees me walk into the room, into this Kiva sort of outside sort of quad area. She looks at me like thunder, eh? And I walk up to her and I go, Sandra, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about that. It shouldn't have happened like that. What I was trying to do was this. And I explained it to her. And I've got tears in my eyes because this is a kid who comes from a really tough family. Her home life is awful. Her parents don't really understand what love is. I don't think they've shown much to her in her whole life. I mean, I've known this girl go through our school a long time. And I've just added to the hurt this part of her life. And she says to me, oh, it's all right, Mr. MacLeod, things are just real shitty at home. And I go, yeah, look, I know that you won't want to go to reconciliation now. I said, but I've got to go down and be with the class, partly because I'm thinking, I hope they've arrived and I don't know what's going on. I mean, that's probably fine, and I'm a little bit anxious. And so I say, look, you just sit here. I said, but if you do come down, can you make sure you go around the cathedral and in the back door, because the normal entrance is through the front. It means you come in front of everybody. I says, because you'll be embarrassed if you come in the front. And she doesn't say anything, and off I go. And I don't expect her to go. And I get in and sit down. They're just at the gospel stage. Father's reading the gospel. And I sit down, and then about a minute later, he's just sort of started his homily. In she comes in the back, walks up the aisle, sits down next to one of her friends. A few minutes later, she goes up to a priest, comes and sits down and prays. Now, if we don't take the opportunities to realise that God's at work at our school, we can miss those opportunities for those kids. I don't think she'd ever been apologised to by a teacher. She was pretty abrasive. And I'm not saying that I did anything particularly special that none of you would do. What I'm trying to do in this, in this sort of reflection is to open our eyes that when we are working in a school and when we're involved in religious education, if the actions that we take don't match the words that we use, then it's as though we're saying nothing. Nothing will resonate. It's unlikely to resonate if our actions don't in some way match the words that we use. Someone told me many, many years ago, you whisper what you say and you shout who you are. You whisper what you say and you shout who you are. This is not a choice. This is just straight reality. If I tell kids regularly in my class that God loves them, and then my actions are that they're not lovable, then it's as though my voice is a whisper. There's nothing I'm saying that's worth hearing. But if my actions match it, now I was blessed with an opportunity this day to go to Sandra and apologise for something where I genuinely stuffed up. And then God worked the rest. My story is not completely unique. You will all have stories like this. You'll all have, but how much do we go back to them? How often do we go back to them and dwell on the fact that this isn't something that's additional to what we do in religious education? That these sorts of experiences form the core of what we do in Catholic education, in religious education. We whisper what we say and shout who we are. And we trust that in the midst, God is working too.